How empires collapse under the weight of debt. In the mid-16th century, if you asked who the richest man in the world was, the answer was obvious. King Philip II of Spain. Picture it. Across the Atlantic, an entire continent, and its mountains were practically overflowing with silver. The mines at Potosí were so productive that Spain was shipping boatload after boatload of silver back to the port of Seville. Year after year, more precious metal flowed into a single royal treasury than the world had ever seen before. And here's where things get strange. This impossibly wealthy king went bankrupt 4 separate times. 1557, 1560, 1575, 1596. On paper, he was the richest monarch on earth. In reality, he was drowning in debt almost constantly. So how does an empire sitting on that much gold and silver keep teetering on the edge of collapse? The answer lies in something that still holds true today. Incoming wealth doesn't slow down spending. It accelerates it. Philip had no shortage of enemies to fight. France, the Ottomans, rebels within his own territories, England. He was often fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. And war, in every era of history, demands the same thing: constant, uninterrupted money. As the silver kept arriving, the king kept raising more armies, building more ships, opening more fronts. But silver took months, sometimes years, to travel from the mine to a ship to the royal treasury. In the meantime, the crown borrowed against silver it hadn't received yet, using Genoese and German bankers as creditors. In other words, Spain was spending tomorrow's fortune today. And at a certain point, even the silver couldn't close that gap anymore. Interest piled up, wars dragged on, debts stacked on top of debts. Eventually, the royal treasury had no choice but to tell its creditors, "We can't pay you right now." This was one of the first major sovereign defaults in the modern sense. But here's the strange twist. All that abundant silver caused a disaster entirely on its own. Imagine a country suddenly flooded with an enormous amount of money, but that country isn't producing a proportional increase in goods, food, or products to match it. What happens? Prices skyrocket. Historians call this the price revolution. Throughout the 16th century, prices across Europe rose steadily, because the amount of silver in circulation grew far faster than the actual output of goods. So Spain was fighting two battles at once: a war debt crisis and an inflation crisis caused by its own wealth. Abundance itself had become the disaster. Now let's shift the scene, about a century later, to France. By the early 18th century, France had a serious debt problem of its own. And this is where an unusual character enters the story, a Scottish economist and gambler named John Law. Law's idea was simple but revolutionary. If a country's gold and silver supply is limited, why not print paper money instead? He sold this idea to the French crown, founded a bank, printed currency, and used it to fund investment in a land company tied to the Mississippi Territory in America. At first, everything seemed to work. Shares soared, people got rich overnight, and the streets of Paris filled with the newly wealthy. But there was no real value underneath any of it. The gold mines the Mississippi Company had promised were never actually found. The entire system ran purely on confidence and optimism. And when that confidence broke, everything collapsed within days. In 1720, the Mississippi bubble burst. Thousands of people lost their fortunes, and France's finances ended up in worse shape than before. The real cost of that collapse was paid years later. Unable to build a trustworthy currency system again, the crown kept imposing new taxes, and the public, already struggling, now carried an even heavier burden. You know where this leads. That resentment, decades later, turned into something far bigger, a revolution in 1789. So here we see a striking chain of events. Mismanaged debt led to a crisis of trust in the currency. That crisis of trust led to heavier taxation, and that taxation fed public anger. And that anger eventually buried an entire monarchy. Now here's an interesting question. At the very same time, just across the English Channel, why didn't England suffer the same fate? England had massive debts too. At one point, its debt ratio was actually higher than many countries face today. But England did something different. In 1694, it founded the Bank of England and tied its debt to a transparent, consistent, and reliable system. Investors trusted that the state would pay its debts on schedule. And because of that trust, England was able to borrow enough to finance its wars, without turning that borrowing into collapse. So the real difference wasn't the debt itself. It was whether trust in that debt could be sustained. Now let's bring these stories together, because they all seem to follow the exact same pattern. First, an empire or a kingdom stumbles into a source of income so large it feels limitless. For Spain, it was silver. For France, it was the seductive promise of paper money. That abundance gives rulers a false sense of unlimited resources. Then, with that confidence, spending increases, wars, palaces, grand projects, usually growing faster than the income itself. At some point, the income slows down or falls short of expectations, but the spending habits are already locked in. This is exactly where debt enters the picture. Governments start spending tomorrow's income today. And finally, one day, creditors, or the public, realize the system can't be sustained. Trust breaks. And once trust breaks, collapse becomes almost inevitable because no one takes that currency, that debt, or that promise seriously anymore. This same pattern doesn't just show up in Spain and France. It repeats itself in Rome's constant devaluation of its own currency, in the Ottoman Empire's inability to repay its debts to European bankers in the 19th century, and even in Weimar Germany in the 20th century, almost following the exact same sequence. So what does this teach us? Maybe the most important lesson is this. What truly makes an empire or a nation powerful isn't the amount of gold, silver, or natural resources it holds. Real strength lies in the discipline to produce more than you spend, and the ability to build sustainable trust that debts will be repaid. Spain, despite all its silver, never built that discipline. France got swept up in the magic of paper money and lost sight of real value. England did something far less flashy, but far more lasting. It turned trust itself into a system. And maybe history keeps asking us the same question over and over in different centuries, with different kings and different currencies. No matter how wealthy a nation appears, what does it truly lose the moment it loses trust in its own debt?